I'm live. Okay, we're going to do a reboot here. My name is Minister Cheryl Dean, and I would like to welcome you to Kingdom Life's 4th Mental Health Symposium. And this morning, I will be joined by Dr. Betty Williams here on my left and Miss Andrea Cook here on my right. I'm going to allow the ladies to say a little bit about themselves when they come forward. But let me introduce the topic to you this morning that we will be discussing. Today's topic is raising the awareness in church culture. And we're going to address transgenerational trauma, domestic violence, and destigmatizing mental health. And today to kick off our topic is going to be Dr. Betty Williams. And she's going to come to you speaking on transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma. Dr. Williams?
Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you.
So let me first tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I also have a doctorate in ministry with a specialization in spirituality. As far as how I come to the topic of trauma, most of my career has been spent working with individuals and family who are experiencing some type of crisis that may or may not be traumatic for them. I'll talk a little bit about the examples that I have encountered either in hospitals or prison settings or nonprofits and or in church life. Now, for some of you, that may bring up some uncomfortable feelings or emotions, maybe even some physical symptoms. And if that happens, I would suggest that you find a trusted friend that you can talk through those emotions with. And if those emotions or feelings continue for the next 2 or 3 days, then I would even suggest you check in with a counselor, with someone professional. There are resources all around you, and Cheryl later will be sharing some of those resources. I will tell you that one of the places I immediately ask people to check into as far as a professional resource is a lot of times your company will have what's called an EAP program and an employee assistance program, and through that particular service, you may be able to get counseling for free. So one of the easiest places and possibly the ability to get counseling for free may be right on your job site through your human resources. And that may not be that may not mean that you would actually see a counselor on the job site, but it may mean that you have a connection to a resource through your job site. So I just wanted to make that clear. And we'll be talking about other resources as we go along in the seminar. So I'm going to be talking about transgenerational or intergenerational trauma. I'd like to start with just talking about trauma and defining that. And then I'd like to talk about what that looks like in individuals, what that might look like in families, and then talk about how the healing of transgenerational trauma works and how the church can have an impact on that and helping us become healthy in terms of dealing with our intergenerational trauma. So, okay, let's start with trauma. I like to somehow separate this idea that stress is trauma, because we all experience stress every day, and we handle that stress in different ways, and we call those coping mechanisms. Stress can be as simple as being able to get through the traffic in Atlanta or in Macon, or it can be as big or dramatic as getting a diagnosis or the death of a family member. Now, sometimes those stressors can be compounded and can become traumatic for us. So my definition of trauma is when there is a crisis or an accumulation of stressors that overwhelm my coping mechanisms or overwhelm your coping mechanism. So I'm going to say that again since we're going to be talking about it for a little bit. The definition of trauma is a crisis or a series of stressors that overwhelm your coping mechanisms. And not only that, trauma or that crisis transforms the way you think about life and the way that you do life. So that is the major difference between just experiencing stress every day and experiencing a traumatic event. It totally, over time, changes the way you think about the world and the way that you interact with the world. And in order to heal from trauma, you have to be very intentional about recognizing that you're experiencing a traumatic event and have some type of intervention in order for that healing to take place. And I'll talk more about that, especially at the individual level. But transgenerational or intergenerational trauma means that trauma is literally transmitted from one generation to the next generation. Now you say, how in the world does that work? If something happens to me, how then does my child experience that happening or that crisis? Well, what we've known for years is that intergenerational trauma typically happens because the first generation, parents for example, experience the trauma, and then how they behave or the emotions that they experience then come out in the relationship with the child or the next generation, the children or the next generation. So, it doesn't even necessarily have to be the parent, whoever the authority figure is in the home or in the environment of that younger generation is the person who transmits the effects of the trauma. So in essence, it's not the trauma itself that's being transmitted, but the effects of the trauma are being transmitted to that next generation. A lot of the ways that we have found out how this works is in the 1960s, there was a lot of research done with families of Holocaust victims. And what they were finding was that children of the Holocaust victims actually were more susceptible to experiencing depression, anxiety, and other types of maladies when they experience crises in their lives. And although the crises wasn't as horrific or dramatic as, of course, the Holocaust, but because these children had parents who had experienced that trauma, then they were more susceptible to having some type of negative reaction when they experience other traumas in their lives. And so that's what we're finding even as we're working with clients today. And I think once I talk about some examples, you'll have an understanding of how you might even see this in your own household, or you might see it with other people in your sphere of influence. There are 3 types of trauma that I like to talk about. One is acute trauma, one is chronic trauma, the other is chronic trauma, and the last is complex trauma. Acute trauma, I'll give you an example of. One day I was working in a prison system that I had been employed with for several months. And it was the kind of environment that was very stressful. There were lots of rules, of course, because they were taking care of prisoners. And there was lots of breaking of the rules. There was a lot of disagreements, and just a lot of anxiety in the air in that particular prison system. On that particular day, when I came to work, it was early in the morning, I found out that one of the security personnel had been called or had called into work and would not be there that day because she had experienced an accident on the way to work. Well, her supervisor was very upset that she would not be into work that day, and basically called her at the accident site and told her that she had to come in to work that day because they were short-staffed. So that particular security person came into work after she had experienced the accident, and one of the supervisors actually came to get me to say, I think she's having a really hard time and I need you to talk with her. I was working as a chaplain at that point, and my role was to support the staff as well as the prisoners. And so I found this particular lady, and we'll call her Jane. And at the point that I found Jane, she was literally shaking. Her body was shaking. Her voice was trembling. And she was trying to go through the process of roll call, which was a part of her duties every day. That was what she was supposed to do when she came in the morning, was to do roll call. I pulled her aside, and we sat down in an isolated area and started to talk. And she said in a very trembling voice, I'm having a very hard time functioning. She said, I keep seeing the accident happen over and over again in my mind, and I can't stop it. And she said, I'm having a hard time focusing and concentrating on what I need to be doing because I keep seeing that accident. And she said, I keep having these questions in my mind about whether that person is okay. She said, I saw this person just lying on the ground after this accident happened. And so what then followed was me talking with her and actually going through some breathing techniques to help her to literally calm her body and her brain down. But what I realized was that she was not going to be able to function for the rest of that day, and so we actually ended up asking her to go home. I actually ended up asking someone to come and get her and to take her home. But I call that acute trauma because it was an immediate trauma and she had an immediate reaction from that trauma. It totally overwhelmed her way of functioning and her way of coping in that moment. That's acute trauma. Immediate, and it immediately overwhelms the coping. Chronic trauma happens to be the kind of trauma that is ongoing. That looks like something that typically would be happening in a relationship of some kind. That might be a domestic violence kind of situation where one spouse is experiencing verbal abuse over and over again and is trying to find a way out. That would be chronic. Complex trauma is a combination of all of that. Complex trauma means there are things that have happened not only that are happening immediately, but there are things that are ongoing that are a part of that those things are breaking down a person's coping mechanisms. I think the pandemic is a good example of complex trauma because we are experiencing so much in the 9 months that we've had this pandemic going on. And some of us are experiencing it differently than others. Some of us have had the death of a loved one. Some of us have had to get through the actual sickness of having COVID, and some of it feeling like it was life-threatening. So some of that was immediate in terms of when you actually had COVID, when some of us actually had COVID, that would have been immediate. But the chronic part of the trauma of COVID is that it's ongoing. And especially in the beginning when we had no idea of how to deal with it. And we were getting different information from the CDC, and we were getting information from these experts who were supposed to know what we were supposed to be doing, but the information was so mixed, and we didn't know if we should wear masks or if we shouldn't wear masks, or if everybody was going to die from it, or if there were just going to be mild symptoms. I mean, at first we were told it was just like the flu, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just been this chronic, one thing after another, that has been a part of this pandemic. And the interesting thing that I think that has been a part of society dealing with this pandemic is that I've met so many people who have this sort of subconscious anxiety that they're not even aware of until I name it for them. I had a teacher that I was casually talking to the other day, and she said, I'm tired all the time. She said, I'm so tired. When I come home, she said, I can't function, and I don't ever remember feeling this way before. And we started talking about her day, and I said, well, what are you doing in a given day? And she said, well, I am trying so hard to protect my kids. She said, she didn't use this word, but something similar. She said, I'm hypervigilant all day long, just trying to keep their masks on, trying to get the sanitizer on their hands, trying to make sure I'm staying far enough apart from them, trying to make sure they're far enough apart from each other. She said, by the end of the day, I am exhausted. And I think all of us are sort of feeling that kind of fatigue from just the day-to-day life of the chronic condition of this pandemic. And I think it's helpful that we name it with each other so that it doesn't become so traumatic that it overwhelms our coping mechanisms. And that is one of the first steps I'll talk about as well in terms of dealing with trauma, is the recognition of what has happened. That is the first step in recovering and becoming healthier, is the recognition of what has happened. And I will say that it's helpful, I think, not only in being able to recognize it mentally, but also to be able to say it out loud. One of the things that I do with a lot of my clients, and probably Cheryl and Andrea can relate to this, is we talk a lot about journaling. And journaling didn't even used to be a word in the dictionary, but I think it is now because the ing has been added to journal. But just to be able to articulate and recognize emotions is the first step in healing, and to be able to even say it out loud that this is what I'm experiencing is very, very important. So those of us who experience trauma have to be very conscious of how we are experiencing the effects of that trauma, whether it was growing up in an alcoholic household or growing up in a domestic violence kind of situation. That is the trend. We have emotions that are sometimes stored inside of us that come from experiencing that as a child or growing up in those situations. So again, it may take a while for us to come to the understanding why we are experiencing those emotions, because sometimes it's hard as adults, because sometimes we have to sit with someone who can help us understand why we are experiencing certain emotions and connect them to the trauma of our past. And for the person or the individual who experiences a particular trauma, it can be felt at many different levels and many different ways. And so I want to talk about those for just a second. So some of the symptoms that we can experience can be cognitive, they can be emotional, they can be behavioral, and they can be spiritual. So I want to throw out some of the symptoms of each category so that you can get an idea of what that looked like. When I gave you the example of the security person, that sort of gave you some idea, but I want to go through them based on category. So a person who is experiencing negative effects of a trauma that has happened in his or her life may have lowered concentration, decreased self-esteem, apathy, rigidity in terms of going at life or doing life. That means just being having some fear and not venturing a great deal, but having a very rigid lifestyle. Disorientation, perfectionism, preoccupation with the trauma, and maybe even thoughts of self-harm or harming other people. Some emotions that a person experiencing effects of a trauma might feel are powerlessness, anxiety, anger, guilt, numbness, fear, depression, and sometimes just an emotional roller coaster. Some behaviors that might come out of that, out of those emotions, may be being irritable with the people around you, being withdrawn, being moody, having sleep disturbance. And also, there are some spiritual side effects of trauma that include questioning the meaning of life, having loss of purpose, having lack of self-satisfaction, just having this pervasive kind of hopelessness, and even anger at God, questioning your belief system. So in order to not allow those symptoms to be manifested in our children or the people with whom we have some influence, it is very, very necessary to find individual healing, to find our healing. And that means that, as I said, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there's something in our past that we really, really need to deal with. Typically, the way we deal with the mental, emotional side effects of trauma is some type of cognitive behavioral interventions. That's what we call it. And it just really involves really changing the thought patterns of the person who has experienced the trauma. This takes some work. This takes the help of someone objective and preferably somebody trained. In order to address the spiritual side effects of trauma, we really need to be able to tap into someone who can help us in understanding our spiritual journey. Barbara Holmes talks about this in terms of being able to look at who we are, not only religiously, but in terms of our thinking about God and our connecting about God. How is it that we tend to connect with God, and how do we choose to connect with God? And of course, a lot of us grew up with two spiritual disciplines that we talk about a great deal, and that's prayer and Bible reading. And those can be done in a multitude of different ways. And one of the things that Barbara Holmes talks about, by the way, Barbara Holmes is a spiritual director and a professor. And one of the things that she talks about is this idea of doing the spiritual disciplines that are more contemplative so that the brain is able to heal. And in some church traditions, a contemplative way of studying and reading and prayer might be foreign. And so in her book, Joy Unspeakable, Dr. Holmes talks about this idea of it really is a part of our heritage. We just haven't articulated the contemplative practices that are part of our heritage that are helpful and healing. And so in her book, Joy Unspeakable, she names some of those practices that we have been doing for generations that we don't even know that are healing for us, but we need to re-articulate, if you will, so that we are intentional about practicing them, so that not only are we healing individually, but we're healing families and we're healing our communities. And one of the things that looks like, I'll just give one example of what she talked about. She talked about, especially in the Black church, when the hymn is sung and there's a way that the congregation starts a rhythm, and usually there's one person who may start the song in this call and response method, where the leader says a line and then the congregation picks up that same line, and it's the same line that's sung over and over again in this particular rhythm until the whole congregation starts to feel that connection. It's an emotional kind of response to each other, and there's almost a rocking, not almost, there is this rocking that helps connect to the music, that helps connect to God. And so she calls this a contemplative practice that is very healing to the brain. So again, not only are there behavioral techniques or what we call cognitive behavioral techniques, but there are also spiritual disciplines that are very impactful in help healing the mind. Because again, the cognitive emotional process that takes place most times as side effects of the trauma is that many people are either very anxious and fearful, or sad and depressed. And those are the emotions we're trying to address. So let's talk about what transgenerational trauma may look like in families who are feeling its effects. And I don't want to get into Andrea's presentation about domestic violence, but I do want to talk about how families tend to respond to one another when one or two people especially the parenting dyad, or who are in the authoritative position in the household, when they are experiencing the side effects of trauma. It may look like some of these symptoms: withdrawal, just incredible mistrust, overprotection, projection of anger and blame, intolerance. In a lot of families where we see abuse, there's high intolerance. There's loneliness, and there's a lot of conflict. Because a lot of times in these households, communication, or appropriate and healthy communication, is not at a premium. And in a lot of these households where the effects of trauma is being experienced, we have a parenting style that's more authoritarian than it is authoritative, and I will explain the difference. An authoritarian type of parenting is where the parent goes by the motto, you do what I say, when I say it, how I say do it, when I say do it. There's not a lot of room for a relationship, but there's more of a dictatorial or a dictatorship style of parenting. The rules are very, very strict and not loose. And there's not a whole lot of room for personal creativity as far as the children are concerned. The hierarchy is very much established, and the children are expected to do instantly, all the time, exactly whatever the parents' standards or expectations are. In authoritative kinds of parenting, the rules are still rules, but there is room for creativity as far as the children are concerned. There is also a premium on relationship. There's a premium on communication between the child and the parent, whereas in an authoritative parenting lifestyle, not necessarily so. And so, again, in an authoritarian lifestyle, there's just more room for growth for everybody in the family system. In an authoritarian parenting style, there's not a lot of room for growth. The expectation is for modeling, that you do exactly what I say that you do. And therein lies the difference. Now, I will tell you, in my experience of working with families, that a lot of times, a lot of trauma happened because there was this thin line when parents came to establishing discipline. There was a thin line between administering discipline and abuse. And a lot of times, when I would sit down with the parent of a child who had been abused, the parent really didn't understand that it was abuse, because what they thought they were doing was administering discipline. And so a lot of times the discipline just totally got out of control because of the parent's own reenacted trauma. Because what typically happens, especially in a household that is authoritative and discipline is the order of the day, and keeping the child in line is the order of the day, that parent typically got that parenting style from their parents and has been passed down for several generations. So there is this sort of subconscious kind of disciplining that happens. And a lot of times it's done out of an emotion and not out of a thoughtful process. Whereas in an authoritarian kind of disciplining style, there's a lot of thought given to the disciplining process. But when you're reacting out of your trauma, and here's the key, and this is really, really important, a lot of response to life is subconscious and reactive. It is not out of a thoughtful place that comes with problem solving. And when we talk about emotional intelligence, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about our actions being out of this place where we use our emotions in a thoughtful way, and instead of allowing our emotions to just be reactive and responding out of our emotions in sort of this automatic kind of way. And I'm running out of time, so I really want to get through my outline and see if I have any questions. But again, in these types of families, 2 minutes, okay. But in these types of families, one of the things that I think is of utmost importance, especially for the church in impacting these families, is to be able to teach a new kind of ethic. And that is, when I talk about ethic, I talk about a way of being and a way of interacting with each other. And in my mind, it's a way of being that comes out of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' teaching. And starting with Matthew 5, there's a sermon, chapters 5 through 7, that's considered the greatest sermon or the most complete sermon that we have recorded that Jesus actually taught. And in the beginning of that sermon in Matthew 5, there are these ways that Jesus talks about being that bring blessings. And he talks about being poor in spirit. He talks about blessed are they who mourn. Blessed are they who are meek. So there's this attitude of being willing to receive and having a teachable attitude. And in that way, being able to receive from God what we need to receive. I think that's an ethic that we can only teach through relationships in the church setting. I'm not even suggesting that there has to be a counselor in every church. I don't necessarily believe that. However, I do think that we have to figure out how to form relationships and mentoring relationships in church settings so that we can impact families by impacting individuals one-to-one. As a matter of fact, the research bears this out. The research says that if we can put couples with couples, then we can have a good outcome in helping the couple that is being mentored have a good marriage. So if we can replicate that in many different ways in mentoring relationships, then I think as a church, we can have impact in families and ultimately have impact in communities. Here's another important point that I want to make before I run out of time. Dr. Harold Koenig at Duke University has studied religion for years and different kinds of religions. And the one thing that he has found that I think is really important that the research suggests is that people who are involved in church or some type of benevolent organization tend to be healthier. I think that as a church, it is helpful for us to get people not just to sit on the pews, but to somehow be engaged in some type of benevolent effort week to week, day to day. That is the thing that helps to transform. And as leaders, we have to be role models in helping that to happen. And not only that, as leaders, we also have to be healthy ourselves in terms of role modeling the ability to deal with our own trauma. Because whatever trauma as leaders we experience, the side effects of our own trauma can then also be visited on our church members. And so we have to be aware as leaders of our own healing and, again, not allow our subconscious ways of dealing with that trauma or reacting to that trauma to be projected onto the people that are that are sitting in our pews. It's really, really important. I used to say I think every leader should go through therapy. If not that, I at least feel like they should go through some type of training program where they're aware of their own trauma. Healthy leaders are important for us healing our churches and our community. Cheryl, do we need to take some questions?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have some?
We don't have any questions, but I do have a question.
Okay.
You mentioned with the parenting style.
Okay.
How could we explain to parents how to break that cycle of the line between abuse and discipline? How do you teach a parent how to improve their parenting?
That's a very good question. I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing in a lot of our communities. I think we first, again, have to get the authority, which would be the parents in the household, to first become aware of their own issues and why they're reacting out of such harsh emotions when disciplining. And I think it's very hard, especially I've found in the Black community, to get parents and any adult to understand that discipline doesn't have to mean hitting. And so teaching different discipline styles and them actually seeing it work is very important. I think what I'm finding with Black families is they don't think if I don't hit, then somehow it doesn't work. And so I have to say the message over and over again so that the parents get it. First of all, they have to buy into this idea that discipline doesn't have to be hitting. And secondly, it doesn't have to come out of some anger, some righteous anger that I'm feeling, and that real discipline really does mean learning for the child. It doesn't mean punishment. That punishment doesn't necessarily mean learning. As a matter of fact, most of the time punishment doesn't mean learning. It actually is about discipline.
Because a lot of times I encounter Because a lot of times what I encounter is that parents will bring their children and say, fix my child. And I always go with, well, I need you to sit with me about 2 to 3 sessions before I fix your child or talk to your child, because it's not about fixing your child. It's about improving the overall family.
Absolutely.
That aspect of it.
And I think when you say that, especially when children hear you say that, especially teenagers, because they're smart, when they hear you say that, they then can buy into the change process. But if you've brought me here to change me, they're not even willing to buy into the process. But if I'm coming with you so that our family can be better, then they can buy into that statement. Right. But again, I want to emphasize, I don't necessarily think it has to be about always coming to the therapy room. I would like for it to be about the church somehow engaging leaders in the church to have that impact, because people will come maybe to some type of church event before they'll come to a therapy.
Absolutely.
For sure, for certain. So do we have some other questions? Or do you have a thought, Andrea?
I do. I have a question.
Okay.
I wonder what you think the role of the church is in helping their parishioners heal from past trauma.
Exactly what I said. I mean, at the risk of being redundant, I think first of all that there has to be this message from the top down that we really buy into this idea of holistic healing. I think we have to really buy into the idea that it's not just about coming to church on Sunday and hearing a sermon. That we really have to buy into this idea that emotions matter, that how we communicate to each other really does matter, and how we interact outside of the church building really does matter. And that's more than about yelling at people from the pulpit. I mean, it really is about these one-to-one modeling relationships about how to communicate. I mean, one of the things as a family therapist that I'm constantly teaching people is about how to listen to one another. I mean, isn't that what we teach people when they come to therapy? I mean, we really just teach people how to listen, because the research says that 80% of communication is actually listening. And for the most part, we have to role model it, and we have to say it and really buy into it, that communication really matters. I think that's the only way we get to this Jesus ethic that I'm talking about. I think this whole meekness, this whole mourning model of being is about not thinking more of myself than I ought, and coming to God and coming to each other with a sense of humility, in terms of not low self-esteem, but just the ability to be able to really hear one another and to really and try to understand one another so that I really can love you as a brother or a sister. Does that answer your question? Any other thoughts or questions? I want to say this real quickly about the way that I feel like the church and community operates in terms of being able to help families. I really think that the church, that there is a cultural agenda, or there is a difference. I'll say it this way. I think there is a difference in terms of the way the black church works in terms of the way the white church works. And of course that's true against different religions, but I can speak to Christianity because I am a Christian and because that has been my training. I do think that as far as the black church, historically, social justice has been one of the issues that the black church has grabbed a hold of and has really tried to make happen. And we're still struggling with that and still trying to figure out how that works in such a complex society. And I know that's still a part of our history and it's still a part of what we need to do. But I do also think that we need to try to figure out how that looks different today, because things are so much more complex than, say, they were in the 60s. And I say that because I also think that white church, if I can say that, have different issues that they are struggling with. And I think this is all a part of generational trauma, really, that has happened in the church, because slavery has been a part of our society and still affects our society. As a matter of fact, the Black Psychological Association is a real organization that is studying the effects of slavery on black people even today psychologically, and how that has impacted us. And one of the things that this organization implies is that because this is a historical kind of trauma, there are still ways in which black people are experiencing PTSD or post-trauma. Not necessarily a disorder, but post-trauma. And that in itself affects the way that we go about the world and ways in which we are re-traumatized when something happens, like when we see the George Floyd videos, or when we're stopped by the police, which a lot of people don't even get or understand, that we keep trying to explain, which in and of itself is re-traumatizing. I'll say this, and I'm going to go, Cheryl, or take a question.
Another question.
Okay. Because I heard a speaker talking about this very idea of minorities being re-traumatized when we are even trying to do the work of reconciliation in the church. Because what happens is, a lot of times, as minorities or black people, we're trying to tell our stories, and we're trying to get understanding from the majority population or from the majority culture. And because the majority culture excuses it or refuses to hear it, it then re-traumatizes the minority population. And so it's almost like we can't find the healing because we are re-traumatized over and over again.
There was a question, authoritarian versus authoritative. Is there room for creativity?
Absolutely.
And what would that look like?
Authoritarian versus authoritative. Authoritative is the one that is more dictatorship-like. Authoritarian, there is a blending and a mixing of the two, and I think it would take some teaching just to talk about. I mean, it probably would take an hour just to talk about the two. But certainly, I think even in an authoritarian type of parenting style, there is still the respect that is expected from the parental, the parents in the relationship. There's just more room for understanding for the child to grow and be more creative, rather than totally demanding that the child look like you. And I see that in a lot of families where the parent is so busy trying to make every child look like him or her that there's no room for the child to be who the child is and have his or her own personality. And even for the child to maybe have some input about the rules in the household and about how the discipline is meted out. I mean, I think parents think that the child will try to get off or try to get the easiest discipline necessary if they had some say-so, but not necessarily. You may be amazed at how creative your child is if you actually sit down and talk to him or her.
And sometimes a child's punishment is way
More
worse.
severe than what a parent would do. If it's discipline. Now, certainly not if it's punishment and it's about hitting. I mean, no child is going to want to be hit. But, yeah. Do you have another question, or am I done?
That is the only question I have, unless, Andrea, did you have another question?
No, I don't have none.
Okay, well, we're going to bring Miss Andrea Cook to the podium, and she's going to speak with us on domestic violence. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. I am Andrea Cook. I am very happy to be here, specifically happy to be standing in a place where a person who I like to call the voice stands on a regular basis. So a little bit about myself is that I am a married mother of 8. I 100% believe in parenting styles, and that parenting styles operate on a spectrum. So my kids would probably tell you I'm more permissive than authoritarian, but somewhere in between most times. So I think there's a healthy balance. I am a doctoral candidate getting my doctorate in couple and family therapy. I believe in the power of therapy. I think that we all should encounter therapists at some point. And a little bit about my history with working with people who have been affected by domestic violence or interpersonal violence, however you'd like to describe it, is in my early 20s, actually probably around 19, I began working at a DV shelter. And experiencing the survivor's experience with domestic violence has touched me in a way that created pathways for understanding and wanting to know more about how I could help and or advocate for people who've experienced DV. From that work, I went on to complete my bachelor's because I wanted to have the knowledge to be able to advocate and work with people. So on the other spectrum, working with people who've experienced and who've survived domestic violence, to now working with individuals who are in family violence intervention programs has been, both of them help impact the other. So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence could be intimate partner violence, teen dating violence, but it's a widespread problem in our state. It's actually a widespread issue in our country. The Office of Violence Against Women describes domestic violence as a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship. So oftentimes we think about domestic violence and we talk about it as if it were just between two adults in a relationship, and that is not always the case. It's abusive behavior that happens in any relationship where one person or partner is attempting to gain and or maintain power and control over another. Common abusive tactics include physical violence, sexual violence, isolation, economic abuse, emotional abuse, intimidation, reproductive coercion, and stalking. There's so many studies that have been done about domestic violence, and there's so many people that are represented in those studies. And I do like to talk about statistics because people understand numbers. So in a few statistics about Georgia is that Georgia was recently ranked 10th in the nation for its rate of men killing women. That's 10th. Firearms were the cause of death in 73% of recorded domestic violence fatalities in 2019. 49% of victims in cases studied by Georgia's Domestic Violence Fatality Review Project began their relationship with the person that they were ultimately killed by when they were between the ages of 13 and 24. In 37% of the cases studied by the Georgia Domestic Violence Fatality Review Project, children witnessed the domestic violence homicide. And so what we just heard about intergenerational trauma, there's so much trauma that our children, the children that we see in schools, the children that we see in the streets, the children that we encounter, that our children encounter, are seeing domestic violence at alarming rates. And that presents itself in children who act out sexually, children who are experiencing trauma, but that trauma looks like ADHD or ADD. A lot of black children are misdiagnosed with some of these disorders when really the root issue is that they have been severely traumatized. And as a society, as a church, as a people, we are going to have to begin to reframe the questions that we ask one another. Children, but also each other. We have to start asking people, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you? In 2018, law enforcement agencies reported response to 44,900 family violence incidents in Georgia. That same year, 26,672 protective orders were issued in Georgia. In fiscal year 2019, there were 66,151 crisis calls to Georgia's certified domestic violence agencies. And when we think about that, almost 70,000 calls that the DV shelters received, those are the people who had the ability to call, the people who had the time, or the people who were allowed to use a phone. Domestic violence is one of the biggest sores of our community. In 2019, 5,024 victims and children were provided 74,633 nights of refuge in a DV shelter in Georgia. 7,530 victims made a request for shelter, but that request was not met. There was no bed, there was no resource, there was no ride. For those 7,500 people, how many of them did not survive? There were 46 certified DV shelters in Georgia as of 2019. We have 159 counties. And 46 of our DV shelters have to support 159 counties. I cannot impress upon everyone that's listening to be a voice for the person that lives next to you that may be dealing with an issue that you may not see or you've maybe never experienced. And so one of the perspectives that we come from when working with people who experience family violence, particularly the person who is usually the perpetrator of that violence, is something that we call the Duluth model. It is the most common feminist approach to addressing DV issues. The Duluth model talks a lot about the power and control wheel. When we talk about DV and the work, what I would ask that people begin to consider and add to your language is a DV program, whether it be a program that's helping to assist a survivor, or a DV program that is helping to assist someone who has been a perpetrator of violence, that those programs be culturally competent and trauma-informed. That is one of the biggest issues that I have with the Duluth model as a provider. Critics do argue that the method can be ineffective. So we're referring, we're sending, we're doing everything that policy says that we should do, and it can be ineffective because it's not culturally competent, and it's not necessarily inclusive of the idea that sometimes men are also abused. One of the best things, though, that comes out of the Duluth model is the power and control wheel. And so I do want to talk to you all a little bit about that wheel. So there's two spectrums on the wheel. There's physical violence and then there's sexual violence. A lot of times when we see relationships, sometimes we don't know the markers of what intimidation looks like. And it can be, domestic violence isn't always physically hitting somebody. So intimidating somebody by making them afraid, smashing things, destroying property, harming pets, displaying weapons. There's also an emotional side to abuse. So it looks like putting somebody down, calling them names, playing mind games, which a lot of us just call gaslighting, humiliating our significant others, making someone feel guilty. There's another part of it where the perpetrator isolates the person that they're in a relationship with. So they control what the person does, who they see, what they read, what they watch, where they go. There's a limited amount of outside influence or involvement, and there's large amounts of jealousy. And this behavior becomes normalized in these relationships. Doesn't mean it's normal. It just becomes a normal habit of how that relationship works and what those children see. So there's a lot of minimizing and denying and blaming and apologizing. The abuser tends to make light of the abuse. They say it didn't happen. They shift responsibility. It wasn't me, baby, it was you. Saying that the survivor is the cause of the abuse. For those of you who like Star Wars, it's like a Jedi mind trick. An abuser tends to always use children. So they guilt the children. After their children saw the abuse, the violence, heard the hitting, the name calling, the general abuse, they use them to relay messages when a survivor decides to leave. They use them with visitation. If visiting happens, they harass the other partner, the survivor, about visitation or anything to do with the children. They use them as a means of continuing that abuse once the survivor is strong enough to leave. When they're with the person that they're abusing, the perpetrators often threaten to take kids away. And, sometimes people ask, well, why did you stay? Why did you stay? Why did you stay? And a majority of the time, it was because they were being threatened with losing their kids. And we do anything for our children. We'd even endure abuse. So men often use male privilege, and there is a significant amount of privilege with being a man. Treating their spouses like servants, making huge decisions without involving their partner, that they are the master of a castle. Oftentimes, men use the tenets of our religious beliefs to hold up these untruths in their relationships. And that's why it's important for the members of churches, for the leaders of churches to be vigilant in identifying these things and making a delineation between who is the head of a household or head of a family and who has control over another. So there's this connection, and I wanted to say it here. I hope that people understand that there is a deep, dark connection between domestic violence and who goes on to either be sexually abused or who sexually abuses others. It's not always an issue or a situation where someone was sexually abused in order to sexually abuse others. It's usually an issue where a child experienced domestic violence, witnessed domestic violence, and uses that trauma and goes on to hurt other people. So, in connecting the responsibility of the church and its members, the church can help to break the cycle of violence. Many women who are in abusive relationships seek help first at church. Church is a safe place. Church is a place where people get retribution. So even if their abusers isolate them from social contacts, they are almost always allowed to still come to church. Recognizing the critical role that church can play, we can address different issues when our members come into our churches. So to women who are victims of violence and who may need the church's help to break out of that pain and the isolation, how do we create an opportunity or a space where victims and or survivors feel like they have an opportunity to get more help from the church? To men who abuse and may not know how to break out of the cycle of violence, how can they seek help and refuge in their church? I believe that it's an amazing opportunity. I also don't believe that every church should have to have a therapist on staff. I do believe that it helps, though. Not only does it help the members, but it also helps the staff. A lot of counselors, a lot of pastors deal with vicarious trauma. We are designed, we are destined, we believe it is our burden to carry the burden of others. And so the church can be a space for those helpers to also receive help. So my question to the people who are watching is, what will you do to help your church in domestic violence? And so, are there any questions? Okay.
Actually, mine has to do with addressing the perpetrator, and you might have said something about this, and I'll just ask you to say more. I once heard a speaker who said it is very hard to hold the anger of a man, because at the risk of sounding stereotypical, at times that anger comes out in such a forceful kind of way that even in a therapy setting, I found as a therapist, it is hard to hold that anger. But sometimes allowing the male to experience anger and figure out how to deal with that anger is a part of the healing process. Do you have any suggestions about how we, not only as families, but as society or communities and churches, can help men in dealing with their anger that a lot of times they don't know what to do with?
Okay, yes. As someone who's been in the room with several angry men who have perpetrated violence against others, I believe that there is no holding the anger. It's only confronting it. And so in working with men who have perpetrated violence, we often allow them the safe space to express that anger. What happened to you versus what's wrong with you? We ask that question a lot. And what ends up happening is that we confront the violence. We ask that people take responsibility for the role that they played in whatever the adjudication process was. And then we use that safe space as an opportunity to learn new skills. And so we teach people how to cope. We teach people that their choices affect other people and how to make better choices. So I don't know that there's a way to hold anger that is...
Let me clarify. When I say hold anger, I'm speaking in therapeutic terms, in terms of being a space where you hold the anger.
Okay.
So I should have clarified, sorry.
Okay. So then I believe that we give people the opportunities and the tools, and we teach them how to have better relationships, because what we see in our practice is 9 times out of 10, the perpetrator is in a class learning how to operate in the world differently, and the person that they abused is usually in the lobby waiting for them. And so there's this awesome researcher, her name is Sandra Stith, who's done a lot of work and believes that, or one of her beliefs is that domestic violence is a relational issue, and so you cannot address it with one person and not address it with the other, and not address it with the children. So while in the state of Georgia, we can't currently mandate survivors for therapy or to engage in therapy, there is some research that has been happening since about 2006 in support of safely engaging in counseling and therapy for the entire family system. Because one of the things about DV is that usually there's a trigger, there's something that happens. And so we need to teach everybody about those triggers instead of just trying to correct the behaviors of the perpetrator.
And I'm going to piggyback off that a little bit also. Helping them gain verbiage. You know, a lot of times they need language, helping them learn how to communicate, helping them also learn how to connect what's going on in the mind into the body so that they can learn about where it's coming from, because anger just doesn't happen.
Right.
There's a process
There's
to
a
it.
process.
So a lot of time we need to recognize, what is that process for you and what does it look like? You know, how can you address this without exploding? And I love the point that you pointed out, what happens happened to you versus what's wrong with you. Where did you witness this from? And it goes back to the traumas that they've experienced in childhood, in adulthood, particularly if we are working with those in a prison system. So giving them that verbiage, new ways of thinking, and also encouraging them that you can change. If we're looking at a church setting, this is the place for healing. So who's going to come walk alongside you that it can readily admit that I was in your shoes once? Because a lot of times we feel like we're alone, and you're not alone. So
I wanted to say that as well, Cheryl. I think that's a good point, that sometimes when we're using the language, and I know as therapists that we can get into the language of perpetrator-victim, but sometimes there are men out there who may not see or hear themselves as perpetrators, but who are struggling with anger and knowing what to do with it. And sometimes anger can be a mask for even depression or fear or frustration or some other type of emotion. I wonder if you could give us somewhat of a picture of what that might look like for a male or female before it gets to the point where it is about striking another person or getting into the legal system. Like, what does that look like for the average person out there who might be on the verge of getting to a domestic violence situation?
I think it's a lot of, I think that we have to examine, or if I were a person who was in a relationship that was being triggered, I would think about the way that I behave. So am I attempting to control somebody? Am I overly jealous about things that maybe, well, honestly, I don't think anybody should get jealous, but am I trying to control the person that I'm in a relationship with? That is like the first trigger, I believe, is do I want to keep this person to myself? Am I a whole person walking into a relationship? Or am I seeking for someone else to complete me? And that is the entryway or the ignition switch to speeding towards a path of destruction. And if there's somebody who's listening who's not in a relationship or who is in a relationship and you have felt like you're getting close to a place where you may want to hit somebody, recognize what you're feeling. There are plenty of programs that are available for you to get some help before you strike somebody. I walk around every day and I tell myself, I can only control myself. I cannot control the person that I've been married to. Although I would like for him to do things differently sometimes. I can't make him do anything. I can't make my kids do anything. I have to model behavior, and I have to behave myself. So if you're experiencing something that feels like you want to begin controlling somebody else, then find a therapist, find a friend, find somebody that you can talk to about those behaviors before they get out of hand.
I'm going to go to this question here. It's difficult to reach out over and over again when you have tried and get ignored. How does the community work in unison when the church, people of God, don't?
Wow. Like, woo. I believe that work begins with one person, and so it is difficult to reach out over and over again. It becomes exhausting. You begin to feel like you're not heard, nobody's listening. But all it takes is one person to listen to you. One person can start a movement. So if you're this person who has been ignored, call me. I will listen. If I can't help you, I will find somebody who can. The community has felt disrespected and ignored for far too long. And so the community oftentimes resembles the way that the church is. But it doesn't mean that the church isn't willing to help. Maybe they just haven't heard you. So, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to that question, but I'll let you go.
And I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. I just think of all of us can give a shot at it. And I wanted to address the church piece because, again, that's part of my wheelhouse. I think sometimes we think that the church is made up of people who don't have issues, and the church is made up of people who have issues. And they are not any more perfect than the other people who walk the streets. They just happen to be in the church. And having said that, my point is that maybe the people you're reaching out to just don't know how to help. And I'm sorry about that, but it may mean that you just need to call a professional who can help you.
That was going to be my response also, because a lot of times, like you stated, we're looking for the church to perform a role that, and I use this, they are not qualified to resolve in that capacity. So that's why you need your professionals. We work alongside of the church, and not only the church but the community as a whole. So another thing that I think we miss is that sometimes we are going on a parallel level to seek help, and we need to really go up a step higher. Friends, family, the church, they have their own issues at times. So they can't quite reach yours. Go a step higher. Go to your doctor. Speak to your doctor about it. Speak to, Betty brought up the EAP, which is your employer assistant program. Go to HR. Reach out to these resources so that you can receive help and you can be heard. So I hope that helps you. If I think of my question, Andrea, I will. A general question. How do we make mental health support more accessible? It seems like you can't get help these days unless you have the money to pay or qualify for free assistance. Oh, I love this one. I love this one. So when we say accessible, so there are two parts that I hear often as a therapist and owning a business and trying to live and survive and all of those things that other people are doing. How do we provide these services where we are also able to help our family, to help our community? Everything cannot be free, unfortunately. Everything cannot be free. We have to begin to make not only our physical health a priority, but our mental health. If we are willing to pay God knows how much for other things, pay for your mental health also. And for the ones who can't afford it, that's why we have programs where you're able to qualify for the free services. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Cheryl. I didn't mean to interrupt, but along those lines, I was going to say that a lot of programs are based on income. So, if you're making $100,000 a year, that means the therapy is a certain amount. But if you're making, $15,000 a year, the services are a certain price. So when you're calling places to ask about what they have to offer, ask them, do you have a sliding scale fee? And a lot of people places may not advertise their sliding scale fee, but they probably have one. Or even ask if you have scholarships available. And sometimes, again, agencies don't advertise that they have scholarships available, but they may have them available, so ask. And I always feel like if you're working in a big company, EAP is the best kept secret that I know of. I work for EAPs a great deal, and every time I talk to a group of people in a company and I say, do you know how to connect to your EAP? The most common answer is no. Yeah, what is that? So yeah, so there are resources. It may take some work to get to them, But I think Cheryl makes a good point in that you have to buy into the idea that my mental health is worth it.
Also, there are grants available even here in Macon, and I know for Warner Robins, Family Counseling Center is a great resource where grants are available for individuals if they receive food stamps, WIC, public housing, any type of public assistance. You are able to qualify for free counseling, but you first have to pick up the phone and call. There's also a VOCA grant, and the VOCA grant is not just for the state of Georgia, but it's for every state in the United States of America, where a person who is a victim of a crime, on which they can produce a police report or a TPO or some type of statement, even from the general solicitor, stating that they are a victim of a crime, and they can receive free counseling. And even if the crime happened in South Carolina, that grant can still transfer over to whatever state they're moving to. So that is a great resource that a lot of people don't know about, and it is all over the United States of America.
Right. I agree. I think that part of what we have to do as a society, as a municipality, is that we have to take mental health and maintaining mental health and mental wellness more serious. Yes, I mean, while I think that municipalities have to take that same approach to what that VOCA money does, you get $3,000 for mental health services. And so what that looks like is that costs nothing to the consumer. The counselor is still being compensated for their time, and they're compensated well under the VOCA, with the VOCA money. So what I continue to advocate for is no-cost mental health care in every city, county, state, worldwide. I think that every time I have the opportunity to talk to someone who makes policy, is that I believe that municipalities should fund a certain amount of mental health services, and that they contract with counselors to provide those services. It doesn't mean it's free it's not a free service. It's a no cost to the consumer service. So that's what I'm hoping, that's what I'm advocating for Macon, so stay tuned.
I have one other resource and thought from a church perspective. There is a ministry called Stephen Ministries that some churches are now doing. They are trained lay counselors who offer wonderful services for people who are going through some type of crisis. They're not emergency crisis helpers necessarily, but they are people who are trained to help people who just may be going through grief or some other crisis that has happened in his or her family. And so for churches who are interested in even establishing a Stephen ministry, you can just go online and look up Stephen's Ministry, STEPHEN, S Ministry, and anybody can start a group within their church. Now, again, it's a lot of work because there's a lot of training, but I think it's worth it because I've seen good Stephen ministry happen, and it is an incredible resource if it can be done well.
We have another question here. How can a child help her father who deals with anger issues without re-traumatizing herself when dad is not open to getting help?
Okay. I really think that child has to appeal to another. I mean, I'm assuming that child is underage, meaning under 18, has to appeal to another adult in order to confront that father. Because in the dyad relationship of parent-child, the parent typically, especially if the parent is experiencing anger issue, is always going to see that child as somewhat subservient to him or her. And so in order for there to be confrontation to take place, the child really is going to need the help of other adults. And And even if it's an adult child, I think the adult child has to do his or her own therapy in order to know the right way to confront that parent, and to be willing and able to handle whatever comes out of that confrontation. Because, yeah, there can be a lot of re-traumatizing that happens. And so the adult child and even the younger child, I mean, ask to go to therapy. You know, ask the other adult in your life to help you to go to therapy. Because, again, it's going back to what Andrea said. We first have to start with helping ourselves.
Right.
And then we can impact the environment around us. That dad may never change,
Right.
but you may need to get your own help and maybe even need to get out of that environment.
Absolutely. For children, I would encourage your children to speak to your school counselor. That is a great resource in the schools that you're able to connect with, to speak about how you can get additional assistance, how you can help yourself, what's going on, and it's confidential in the realms of unless they don't see where you are hurting yourself, hurting someone else, or a judge needs some information, but this information readily it's confidential, and you can get some coping tools for yourself.
And just to kind of round those two awesome comments out or responses, is that the only person that you can control is yourself. And so do your own work. And if you're an adult, seek out your own counselor and work through that initial trauma that you've experienced, so that you can build your toolbox for when you encounter this father who's not interested in getting help. If this child is underage, like my colleague said, is that you find a trusting adult and get support that way.
Andrea, I have a question for you. Can you speak on, or if you have any information about stalking and cyberbullying and with domestic violence?
One of the research articles that I've read and talks heavily about stalking and online bullying when you are in a relationship or when you were in an abusive relationship. And one of the things that the article said is that you document everything. Document meaning take screenshots. Document your efforts for telling this person not to contact you anymore. Document your efforts with contacting law enforcement. Because there's a certain level to a person antagonizing you that you have to, unfortunately, that you have to prove in order to get a temporary protective order against somebody. So, one, keep all of your social media pages private. If that person still finds you, document. What another person and what a lot of counselors are told to do is use a different spelling of your name when you're using social media, or have a pseudonym. Do everything that you can to keep yourself safe. But if that person still finds you, document, because if you didn't document, it didn't happen.
Can I address something that, again, may not be as severe as stalking, but what I encounter a lot, especially with young adults, is the back and forth, what I call spinning in a relationship. Like we're not quite not together, but we're not quite together. And
The on-off syndrome.
And so I do a lot of teaching to young adults, especially about how to end a relationship and how to set boundaries. And so I just want to put that out there, that a lot of times what may even feel like stalking, or what may even feel like the eternal relationship that I can't get rid of, may be about the inability to set real boundaries and to have a firm no. And you may need some help in learning how to set boundaries and learning how to have a firm no. Do you want to speak to that at all, Andrea? Do you want to say any more about that?
I I don't know if it's been my experience, but that just seems like something that the millennial society does. It's never really, not never, but oftentimes it's not firmly out of a relationship. It's 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And that's because, well, from what I've gathered from talking to my nieces and nephews, is that you want to have options. And so, well, I mean, but that's just what they've said to me. And so I think having the approach that I take, or the conversation that I have with people who are slightly younger than me, is that you have to do the situationship thing in a way that is respectful of you and the person that you're in a relationship with. But it's hard because, you know, we're taught to be a monogamous society, and then there's so many people who sometimes don't believe in monogamy. So the people that I have talked to or counseled, is my stance is that I'm suspending judgment. But I mean, you know what floats your boat. But I just think that it is a sign of the times, and so I encourage the people that I talk to be cognizant of respecting yourself, respecting others, and being safe.
And I think I go from the standpoint of, what does healthy dating look like? You know, what does that look like? And it goes back to the question that we kind of addressed earlier. You know, what are those red flags? Are you being pushed, shoved, grabbed, pinched? You know, are you being asked to call every 5 minutes, or you have that checkup call? You know, where are you? Those are red flags. You know, are you being asked not to take time with family or friends, or you're only with this one person all of the time? You know, those are red flags. And I tell my clients all the time, if it looks like a duck, act like a duck, walk like a duck, quack like a duck, it's a duck.
Quack,
you know,
quack.
It's a duck. You know, this is a red flag. And oftentimes we see the red flags, but we ignore it because it's not that bad. Right. But this is where it starts. Again, the same thing with anger. There are levels to this thing. You know, it just doesn't happen. And helping them recognize what those red flags are and take them for what they're worth. Take them at the moment. So, any other questions?
I don't have any other questions. So,
okay.
if you're okay, then I'm gonna have my seat.
All right, Al.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Those were some wonderful questions, and I do thank our audience for asking questions. That is a very, very brave thing to do sometimes, just ask a question. And I thank you for that. Although we are not face-to-face, this is another way that we are growing together and learning how to socialize and gain information without being face-to-face. So I did want to go over some myths, and it's really looking at the church in regards to domestic violence, and I want to speak a little bit about trauma, and I'm going to wrap things up with how we can begin to destigmatize mental health. One of the first ways is just having a healthy discussion about it. The church is supposed to be the place where we come with our sickness, our illness, and regardless of what that is, having this safe space to be able to do that. So having the conversation is one of the key pieces to destigmatizing mental illness, having a place to talk about domestic violence, having a place to talk about trauma, because those are conversations that aren't had a lot of times in the church. So let's look at a myth here. So, myth number 1. Domestic violence does not occur in the church. Trauma, domestic violence, mental illness, it knows no race, no creed, no religion, no socioeconomic status. It doesn't understand any of those things, and it can and it does happen in the church. So that is a myth. Number 2, submission will solve the problem. When it comes to abuse, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, oftentimes pastors don't even know how to respond to the victims. This is a myth. When ministry leaders, when we quote scriptures, Ephesians 5:22 and 1 Peter 3:1-6 and Titus 2:3-5, as we remind most times women to submit and to pray for our husbands and to have a quiet spirit and to be obedient. These messages, they work well in healthy relationships, but submission to an abuser gives them license to abuse further. So when the church affirms an abusive man's role as the head of a household, it gives him permission. It's giving him feedback saying that, it's okay for you to have this need to be in control. Now, if it's in a healthy relationship and you're both doing the same things and you're honoring the scripture when it says submit to one another, and that's understandable. But when you're working with someone that is an abuser, it sends a totally different message. The key thing for abuse is control and the desire for power. That's what it's about, control and power. Myth number 4, domestic abuse isn't as bad as domestic violence. Abusive behaviors such as name-calling, shaming in front of kids, criticizing your clothing, controlling finances, that is an abusive behavior. And forcing a spouse to have sex often leads to more violent behaviors. Again, if someone is keeping you from your family or your friends, they're controlling all of the money, you're being bullied, criticized, these are all abusive behaviors. This is domestic violence. And abuse is abuse. It's abuse. Number 5, if an abuser is truly sorry and forgiving, the relationship should be reconciled. Statistically, victims will return to the destructive relationship 7 times before leaving for good. Church leaders some churches require victims to forgive and reconcile, but they don't fully understand the scope of trauma, and this is what we've been talking about today. Forgiveness is a process, and sometimes just because we say it out of our mouth, our actions aren't following through with those words. This is a safety issue. So how can ministry leaders help? We can learn to listen and validate. If that man or that woman, because domestic violence and intimate partner abuse also happen to men, if they are desperate enough to admit the abuse to their leaders, they deserve attention. as Betty spoke with the Stevens Ministry. Train leaders. Invite counselors and leaders to nonprofits to train church leaders. And when we are educated, we can help devise a plan. Provide resources. We can stock our resources on domestic violence and helpful websites and numbers for safe homes. We can check our current church policies. Does the church have a written non-tolerance policy? Is there an advocate on our teams who can provide support for the women and men in the church, or the staff members, or even the pastor's wife? Because a lot of time, some domestic violence is happening in the homes of our clergy. So who's holding them accountable? We can offer practical help. As we've discussed, one of the main reasons women stay in relationships or marriages is because of finances. We want to keep our families together, and we have limited finances or limited educational knowledge and skills, so we stay in the relationship and hope that it will get better. Are there coaches and counselors who can help our members devise a plan of action? When we're thinking about the kids, are the youth ministers and the youth pastors going to provide emotional support to the children? Are the elders of the church willing to confront the spouse, be it wife or husband, to help him or her address the issues and work towards emotional healing? Does the church have a benevolence fund to help with bills, gas, counseling? Is there a food ministry to provide meals? Does anyone who owns a business in the church, are they able to employ this member when they're in need? Again, oftentimes a wife, she has limited skills sometimes in that relationship. So she's more likely to remain. And will someone in the church be willing to come forward who've lived through domestic violence or recovered, or will they come through to walk alongside the brother or sister and provide them with emotional support as they go through their journey of healing also? As ministry leaders, we can no longer deny that domestic violence and abuse and trauma does not exist in the church. When we step up to shed light in the shadows, we can truly provide a space for healing from the brokenness and influence the next generation on how to live a healthier life, how to have quality in life, and healthy, joyful relationships in which our Bible and the Word of God tells us about. And then community will be able to see the church exemplifying a Christ-like love. So in ways in learning how we can begin to destigmatize mental health. Again, having the simple conversation about it. The language that we use, if we're joking about mental illness, or if we are, one of the things I try to be conscious of, saying the word crazy and not throw that word around. Helping an individual understand that you are not bipolar. You may have bipolar disorder, but that label does not have to define who you are. Your mental illness does not have to define who you are. You just have to find a way, with help and skills and your counselor, your family, your friends, and sometimes your friends are your family, to live life differently. Your way may not look like anyone else's, but if it's working for you in a healthy way, that's your way, and it's okay. Get treatment. Go see your psychiatrist like you see your primary care physician. Go see your counselor the same way you would go to the urgent care to get the cut on your finger taken care of. Go to your appointments. Get treatment. Don't let the stigma create self-doubt and shame. I encourage you and invite you not to isolate yourself. And again, don't equate yourself with your mental illness. Join a support group. And sometimes the support group is a small group at your church. Or it can be a small group of friends that you trust and that's encouraging and uplifting to you. That they have carte blanche in your life to say, hey, I've noticed something different about you. And you're readily able to listen to them and say, yeah, you're right, I haven't been taking my meds. And if they say these things to you, it will help you to get back on the right track. Because your behaviors more than likely is noticeable to others before you even notice them yourself. So a small support group. For my young viewers, my children, my kids, my teens, get help at school. Speak out against the stigma of mental illness. There is help. So some numbers that I would like to give you, I'm going to let you get a sheet of paper and something to write with. And I'd like to start by giving you the telephone number for the Southern Center for Choice Theory. That number is 478-741-1268. The crisis line, this is a 24-hour hotline also, 478-745-9292. River Edge, 478-803-7600. The Family Counseling Center, 478-745-2811. Seeds of Life Counseling Agency, 478-227-6525. The Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE, SAFE. And that's 1-800-799-7233. The TTY line for the National Domestic Violence Hotline in English or Spanish, 1-800-787-3224. And again, when you are calling these numbers and you are soliciting help, please do not be afraid to ask questions. Even if it's, do you have a connection with someone in my local area? How can I get help with shelter, emergency care? Ask questions. I encourage you not to be afraid. This is one of the bravest steps that you can ever take seeking help. And I applaud you for doing it. So I'm going to leave room if there's any other questions. Please post them now. If not, I would like to thank my colleagues here, Dr. Betty Williams and Andrea Cook, for providing your knowledge and spending your time with us today. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to having you again on program in the future. I'd like to thank Kingdom Life and our pastor, Dominique Johnson, and thank you for all of your support. Thank you for your questions, audience, and we do look forward to seeing you again in this capacity. This is what the church is for. We are for also giving information, not just on Sunday, but every day. So if there are no other questions, I'd like to close in prayer, and we will end our presentation. Father God, in the name of Jesus, I thank you for the words that you have given today, Father. I thank you, Lord Jesus, for the vessels that you have used. And God, I ask that you continue to give them wisdom, knowledge, and understanding to help these your people here on earth, God. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for covering your people, Lord Jesus. Thank you, Father, for opening doors for resources that others may be able to come out of situations, God, and go into new situations, God. Thank you for awareness, God, and thank you for your shield and protection and your guiding light upon their lives. We bless your name, Father. We praise you. In Jesus' name, we pray. Amen. Thank you, and this will conclude our presentation.